kind of dark in here compared to how beautiful it is outside. So I'm Doug Arent at the National Renewable Energy Lab, as mentioned, Deputy Associate Lab Director there for Scientific Computing and Energy Analysis. And I think the history back to USAEE went, more than 15 years to a time when we were asked to put on a renewables session here in Bloomfield, actually in 2005. And frankly, the world's changed a lot since then. So it is an absolute pleasure. Feedback? Is that okay? To host a conversation. So we're not going to do a traditional keynote speech. We're going to do a conversation between us and actually among us. So get your thinking cap on and your questions ready. With Bill Ritter, who, great friend for many, many years, 41st governor of Colorado, passed 57 laws, pieces of legislation while governor, including the Clean Air, Clean Jobs Act, and many others to really, I'd say, launch the transition of Colorado's clean energy economy. And he took a wise pause a few years after that and decided to focus on his family. And as doing that, he also founded and became the director of the Center for the New Energy Economy at Colorado State University, and has from that perch and a few others, including a couple of boards that are quite renowned and very active in the U.S. Energy landscape, continues to drive for change. And so, Bill, it's a pleasure to be here with you, and thanks for joining us.
Great to be with you. Thanks.
Why don't you tell us a bit about the vision for the center and kind of where you started and where it's at now?
Yeah, so this is more than 8.5 years now. When I left office, the governor's office, I went to Colorado State University, started a center there at the invitation of the president, and the intent of the center was to work with governors across the country on energy policy. When I had been governor in the space between 2007 and 2011, we had been quite active on the energy and really the climate landscape, as had a lot of other states across the country, and the United States Congress had passed virtually no real comprehensive energy legislation. They did a few things with the tax code that really impacted the development of clean energy in America, particularly the production tax credit, the investment tax credit, things like that. But in terms of doing things that I think were comprehensive and meaningful, most of that's at the state level. So I decided to work with governors. And since that time, I've done a lot of things around the country with governors and with states, but we've also morphed into working with state legislators. And so I run a state legislator clean energy academy, in part because of all of the sheer volume coming out of the states. This year, more than 4,500 pieces of legislation will be introduced at the state level that impact clean energy or climate. And probably only 600 to 650 will be actually moved into law. We've had good examples around the country where 4 or 5 bills are introduced and one of them becomes a bill that has everything else kind of put inside of it. Yeah. And so we work with state legislators, we work with governor's offices, and then we do a variety of other kinds of convenings. I convened 15 governor's offices in July to talk about 2020, what the next legislative session might look like. Again, we did this academy. I've just spent some time in Oregon, worked with Portland General Electric, so I'll work with utilities as well on their resource planning and sort of how it intersects with policy making. I was in Oklahoma 2 weeks ago to speak at a statewide conference because Oklahoma's done a variety of things, but still is trying to understand what their role is as state policymakers in this energy transition. So we'll work with utilities, with utility commissions. We were the convener for 13 states when the Obama administration put in place the Clean Power Plan. And each state was supposed to file its own implementation plan for the Clean Power Plan, but we were the group that was looking at really a regional solution and how you map that regionally. If the Clean Power Plan had not been stayed, we probably would have written a cap and trade program for the western United States and North Dakota and South Dakota as part of of compliance with the Clean Power Plan. So our thing is to not focus on the federal level, to really try and understand in a federalist system where you have state governments and a federal government and actually local governments and the private sector all interplaying in an energy sector, what role states play, and then how that's impacted by utilities, utility commissions, and other parts of the private sector.
Yeah, that's great. So the title said State of the States, and I apologize. I put the 250 million in there because I was thinking that, there are 31 states.
Yeah.
DC covers about 250 million people that all have clean energy policies in place, not goals, but real policies. And he chided me on the phone in the prep and said, no, this is about 350 million. It's about everyone. So tell us about the state of the states and really the why there's such a drive, I think, from the state level.
Funny conversation with Doug and me. I said, that's 100 million people we're leaving behind. That's probably not a good thing to talk about. And so the state of the states, it's really quite fascinating. And I guess it goes back probably, in my mind, to the states looking at renewable portfolio standards in the early part of the millennium and saying, this is one way to move clean energy is to do a renewable portfolio standard. And eventually, there were 31 states that had a renewable portfolio standard of some kind, either a goal or a legislative target that you had to hit, but something in the law that had that out there in front of you. And it was really, if you put all the people who lived in a state with that, it'd be the 4th largest country in the world. That's how many people. And there's a lot of the population centers in the United States where their state has that. That was kind of the early way of doing it. And like I said, it wound up being 31 states, including states like Texas, which had a renewable goal, Oklahoma, which had a renewable goal. But, over time, it became quite sophisticated compared to the early days. So to the extent renewable standards were a good thing, there's a variety of ways to move a clean energy agenda using energy policy. And we actually did a gap analysis of the 50 states. We call it State Policy Opportunity Tracker, so spotforcleanenergy.org. We looked at all 50 states and we looked at 38 policies. Now, not really so much in the oil and gas world as a part of this. This is more about sort of advanced energy, the things that are going to move an energy economy that have to do with renewables, with grid modernization, with the financing of energy transitions. And we said, how far along are states in this? And it was 38 different policies, and I would argue today, since we started that, there are even more sort of policies that are moving and levering it. But clearly, states are involved in this in a really serious way. If you think about our election last year in the United States, there were 34 governors running for election. 9 of them, so over 25% of the governors who won campaigned on 100% either clean or 100% renewable. And if you think about legislators in the state legislators, so every state in the United States has a legislature. All but Nebraska have 2 houses. Nebraska's unicameral, it's called. But 550 legislative candidates who took office ran on 100% clean or renewable. Wow. This is this remarkable time. I mean, we got to 10% by ballot in Colorado in 2004. We doubled it to 20% in my first 100 days as governor. We went to 30%, and people said it was a real stretch, and there were so many naysayers out there saying you'll never get to 30% renewable by 2020. Our investor-owned utility, the biggest one that has to comply with this, is Xcel Energy. It's about 2/3 of all the energy they provide electricity in Colorado. And not only are they going to get to the 30% by 2020 out of their own volition, because they want to and because the market's driving them, not because they're required to, they're going to go to 55% by 2025. 55%. And a long time ago, if I had said, well, let's say 12 years ago when I was governor in my first year, if I'd have said, we're going to get our utility to 55% by 2025, people would have thought I was smoking something that's actually now legal in Colorado to smoke, but was not at the time legal. And it just was, and so states across the country are doing this. And so there's all these states now that have passed legislation that has to do with pretty significant renewable portfolio standards, 50% by 2030, 80% by 2040, 100% by 2045. California has a standard that says 100% clean by 2045. 60% of that's going to be renewable. The other 40% can be whatever. So when I say state of the states, it's not every state. Like Alabama is still a laggard state. Mississippi is still sort of not coming along in this fashion. Ohio actually set back the clock on this. They repealed their renewable portfolio standard. They put a moratorium on it for a while, lifted the moratorium because Governor Kasich at the time would not allow the moratorium to continue, but after he was out of office in the first legislative session after Governor Kasich left, who was a Republican, they repealed the portfolio standard. So there is still some pushback against this, but in states across the country, there have been some really significant things happening on the clean energy side legislatively that still do involve renewable portfolio standards, energy efficiency resource standards, and different kinds of energy policies that push the envelope.
So that landscape begs two questions. One is, what's the interplay between, I'll call it economics and policy? Because as you said, back in the early 2000s, no one would have dreamed of 50, 80% goals by states, and what has given legislators, governors the confidence that they can do that, and frankly, utilities. And then for the laggard states that you mentioned, and where does economics play in that? Because it may, so my question is policy kind of necessary but not sufficient, or sufficient and necessary along in the economic realm as well? So
I'd say there's a variety of ways to think of this. You have to kind of think of this in context. First, you have a federal administration that came in saying it was going to resuscitate the coal industry and, quite frankly, the nuclear industry in the United States. And it's failed miserably. And why did it fail? It failed because while policy has been important over the last 10 years, markets took over. So we have mapped all of the coal in the West. When I say we, my center has mapped all of the coal that existed in the West in 2008. And by 2035, 90 to 95% of that will be gone. No one 11 years ago would have said that 95% of the coal that exists today is going to be gone in 27 or 28 years. They would have thought you crazy because it was heavily fossil fueled. But in that time frame, that since 2008, there have been some policies that were about air quality issues, Clean Air Act kinds of things, but we've also seen this steep price decline in renewables. So in wind, in that time frame, the price decline is 70, 75%. In solar, it's 80 to 85%. In storage, it's 90%. And so this steep decline has made it really non-economic to continue to run coal. That's part of it. The other is natural gas. So the low price of natural gas, it's hovered, somewhere north or south of $3 an MCF since 2009. It was at $13 in 2007. Right. Came down to $3 the Henry Hub. And that low price for natural gas, the steep decline in renewables, and you can't run coal. It's not economic. So market forces changed, along with some things that were happening that had to do with air and air quality. The mercury rule has the regional haze rule, and then the SIPs around NOx and SOx were important EPA things that drove people to think about the expense of installing scrubbers. But the biggest fuel generation from coal in the United States, Navajo Generating Station, was co-owned by 4 utilities and a minority position by the Bureau of Reclamation. The 4 utilities voted to shut that generation down because they said they were losing $100 to $125 million a year generating from coal rather than generating from an option that involved gas, solar, storage, or wind. and nobody's going to lose that kind of money. It has a terrifically bad impact for the Navajo reservation, for the Hopi Indians who have the Peabody coal mine. So there's some real consequences of doing that, but the non-economic position of coal-fired generation is something that's causing, these coal generation to shut down. Just one other point, if I can, Doug. One of the things we also looked at is, okay, what's the new generation replacing coal in the United States? Well, what's really fascinating about this, if you look at the Western Interconnect, it's 11 states. It does not include North Dakota and South Dakota, but everything sort of west, if you draw a line down there from Montana all the way sort of down to New Mexico, the Western Interconnect, there's no new net natural gas in the West with the coal that's gone away. There's new gas, but there's other gas that's gone offline. There's no new net natural gas. In the rest of the country, with all the coal that's gone offline, the new net natural gas is 75% of what's been picked up. So as coal's gone away in the rest of the country, it's been replaced by a lot of natural gas, but in the West, where the resources are so heavy for renewables, there's not new net natural gas, just new renewables.
Yeah. In the East, the places where you say the laggard states are, if I could, south and southeast. Yeah. Southern Company, as an example, has come forward with a strong plan to decarbonize. And that, I presume, is from the corporate perspective of economics. How does that play, how does the interface play between utilities serving areas and their regulators / government leaders? Yeah,
they're lagging, but I don't think they're going to be allowed to lag for long. And there's not policy in a place like Mississippi to say to Mississippi Company, which is a subsidiary of Southern Company, go do this. There's some objection to there being that kind of regulatory effort, even though the electricity sector's been regulated since, the latter part of the 19th century, the early part of the 20th century. But there's some still problem around that. But the shareholders of Southern Company are ultimately going to be, I think, the groups that force this kind of decarbonization. Xcel Energy operates in 7 states. And interestingly, like I said, they're going to get to 55% in Colorado. But last December, Xcel said, we're going to reduce our emissions from 2005 by 80%. That was pretty ambitious. We're going to do by 100% by 2050, they said. That was even more ambitious. They said, interestingly enough, we have no idea how we're going to get to 100%. But then they did something really interesting. They drew up legislation, and they passed legislation this year, the legislature did in Colorado, that puts that 80% emissions reduction as a part of the law. So by law now, Xcel has to reduce its emissions in Colorado by 80% by 2030. And the interesting thing that happened, and this is not just Colorado, it happened also, it's happening in New Mexico and Nevada and states like New York, Massachusetts. They're combining clean energy policy with climate policy. So we had 2 separate pieces of legislation. A bill that had a lot to do with the electricity sector, not just Xcel Energy, but our other independent power producer for rural co-ops. That bill moved through and was passed. And then this bill that was the climate bill, where our legislature passed a bill saying through every sector, we have to reduce our emissions by 50% by 2030. Now, Xcel Energy doesn't want to be over here with the Air Quality Control Commission because they're an electric utility. They've always been under the jurisdiction of the Utility Commission. So what they did was have this legislation passed that said, as long as you're going to get to your 80% reduction in emissions from your 2005 number, the Air Quality Control Commission is not going to haul you in and have you, force you to try and demonstrate. Your resource planning has to be such that you can get to your 80% reduction. So utilities are hoping that they can stay in one realm and not this other realm. But New Mexico, Nevada, Washington, if you pay attention to this, Oregon's effort sort of failed. Mm-hmm. The state of Oregon had a cap and trade program they'd worked on for 5 years. They're ready to pass that legislatively. And kind of at the end of the session, they were moving it forward. It passed in the House, got to the Senate, and all the Republicans walked out, so they didn't have a quorum to pass it. But it would have been a state passing a cap-and-trade bill that was economy-wide and probably would look a little bit like California's cap-and-trade.
Yeah. So begs a whole set of questions on power or economy-wide decarbonization. So Mary Ann started us off kind of reflecting the global scientific and actually political consensus around trying to achieve fairly deep decarbonization to, maintain temperatures at 2, maybe 1.5 degrees at a global level. Where does power play, decarbonized power that we just talked about, play in this broader economy? Or, frankly, what are you seeing as efforts across the broader parts of the economy, be it energy efficiency, which is still the low-hanging fruit that we don't talk about enough, and transportation, 2 big ones, but maybe the industrial sector as well?
Yeah, so you probably all know this, but 2 years ago, power sector emissions were eclipsed by transportation emissions, in part because the power sector emissions were going down. This has everything to do with the replacement of the coal-fired fleet with renewables, natural gas, energy efficiency. There's a lot of places where the demand just hasn't picked up. Even since the Great Recession, you'd think there would be, because the economy has grown in such a significant way, the demand would have grown for it, but we've been employing energy efficient measures. So you've got a combination of factors about why the power sector emissions are going down. Unfortunately, transportation emissions have gone up and continue to go up so that they eclipse the power sector. And unfortunately eclipsed it in such a way that last year our emissions as a country went up with all that we're trying to do. So power sector emissions now run second to transportation emissions, but industrial emissions run third, and they're at 22% of all emissions. So when you start thinking about how you reduce this economy-wide, and for us here in Colorado, where we have a 50% reduction goal, we're going to have to demand more from the power sector. Because quite frankly, we know that we're getting there and probably can get beyond, in many parts of this country, 50%. And we're not going to get to 50% in the transportation sector. There's not going to be wholesale adoption of zero emission or low emission vehicles in another 11 years, so that we can look at that and say we get our 50% there. So we're going to have to do more for the power sector and expect less from the transportation sector, but we have to make that move. This is a really important thing, and unfortunately, again, this is a place where the states were sort of leading the way. There are 25 states now that have low emission vehicle standards of some kind, either by executive order or in legislation. There are 10 states that have zero emitting vehicle standards. So Colorado just passed ours. We were the 10th state, and it's pretty complicated, but think of all of the fleets in Colorado needing to have 5% of their fleet be electric vehicles or zero emitting by 2023. Now, what that relies upon is a California waiver that the state of California has had in place from the Environmental Protection Agency that says, quite frankly, whatever the EPA has in place, if California wants to go beyond it, they have the ability to do that. The Obama administration got to a 56 mile per gallon fuel economy by 2026, I believe it was. Maybe it's 55 miles per gallon by 2026, but something like that. And the Trump administration said, we're not going to go there. We're going to hold this at the 2020 level, and that's about 23 miles per gallon. And California says, we want to go beyond that, as do a variety of other states. Tend to be exact, want to go with California, and now we're litigating whether that waiver is going to remain in place. I hosted 9 members of Congress in Washington, D.C. We brought in some subject matter experts to help them think about emissions. And one of the subject matter experts from the auto industry said, the waiver in California is the most important piece of climate legislation in the country, in part because we need to get a handle on our transportation sector emissions. And if we don't, then we have really no chance of hitting the Paris target and very little chance of states being able to hit their own individual targets that have pretty serious emissions reduction.
Okay. What about the interplay or the attractiveness of electric vehicles for light-duty vehicles, which are still a huge part of our transportation fleet. And then what about the interplay? So even here in Denver, we look at mobility patterns, right? And then try to figure out where should charging stations be in order to serve customers, frankly. And then you've got the whole question of policy about when does it charge, how does it charge, what about distributed generation to support that. This interplay between transport or electric mobility more broadly and power. Do you see that on the front edge of conversation, or is it two separate conversations that need to be brought together?
No, I don't think it's a separate conversation. Yeah. I think in many states around the country, mobility is part of the thinking around what I would call the energy transition. And, I kind of intimated this before when I talked about the shutdown of coal. In the utility world, that's kind of quick to do something in 25 or 30 years because of how far out they plan resources. In my earlier comments, was a little pessimistic about how quickly we can do this transition in EVs, but the thing that can spur it is our cities and sort of how they plan around mobility. And so there are some interesting conversations going on, and cities in their relationships with utilities. There's a variety of cities that have pretty serious goals on their own emissions reduction or renewable energy goals. Most of the major cities in America have formed, their own associations around this kind of thing, and mobility is something that they can impact. I think the two places they can impact are mobility in the built environment, because most building codes are passed at the local level. Yeah. Sometimes they have a state mandate to do things, and that can help as well. So it is about infrastructure, building out the charging infrastructure. It's about options that are zero emitting, that don't have to do with vehicles. So that's a part of it, and it's about relating back to the utility. Okay, what are the kinds of things you're going to do to put in place a charging infrastructure and be able to utilize that? Then there's the utility's own tension with distributed generation, which an electric vehicle sitting in a garage that's charging and that can feed back onto the grid becomes a form of distributed generation, but an important way for utilities to be able to meet load and flatten some curves that they otherwise have, where there's a difference between demand and load. So it's a pretty interesting world there. I'd say light duty is part of the conversation. I've been impressed that something we would not have talked about we wouldn't have talked about this 10 years ago, is the role that EVs could play in heavy duty and medium duty transitions. And so most of the conversation 10 years ago, when you're in the vehicle sector talking about heavy duty, was natural gas and what role either compressed natural gas or more likely liquid natural gas is going to play in over-the-road trucking. And now the major fleet carriers in the United States are looking seriously at a transition sometime, complete in the 2030s, that would, for instance, if your UPS take 18,000 of their trucks and put them 1 megawatt battery on that truck, so that you have basically an EV fleet. You also automate a variety of those, so it's a self-driving EV fleet with a major freight carrier. And I tell you, if UPS does that, FedEx and Amazon and the other, they're all competing for that space, and it's going to be difficult for utilities to be part of that transition and to have the kinds of chargers that they're going to have. The person who will be a billionaire is the guy or woman or man who invents the platform for utilities to turn to know what their load will be on a given day, what they have to have in the way of a charging infrastructure for the over-the-road fleets that aren't, return home fleets. That's going to happen. Yeah. And, people would have sounded like some kind of a wild futurist to talk about that a decade ago, and now they're talking about it in boardrooms, in the major fleet carrier boardrooms.
Yeah, it's pretty impressive. If you have a question and you want to start thinking about it and stand up to the microphone, we're going to transition to audience engagement here in a couple of minutes. Let me go down the pathway of thinking about the implications for hydrocarbons for a little bit, particularly here in the U.S. I mean, we've transitioned incredibly from an import to an export country. We have no shortage of molecules. certainly we have issues, I'll call them above ground or extraction issues and transport issues. But the implication of the transitions you talked about are that natural gas and frankly oil for mobility and frankly for the petrochem industry are going to be around for a while, because a lot of this audience is from the oil and gas sector or studies the oil and gas sector. How do you see that evolving, and what are the implications for their business models, they being the oil and gas industry business models that maybe we don't have a very clear crystal ball on, but we've seen at least some indications from some of the big majors on how they're thinking?
Yeah, so let's start with the power sector.
Yeah.
Because go back to something I said before, and I think this is true, in most places across the United States, wherever these big targets are being set, this sort of 100% target or 100% reduction in emissions, they say at the same time, if they're honest, we don't know how we're going to get there. And I think California was pretty honest when they passed that 100% clean and said we're going to get 60% of it renewable. The other 40% we don't know. And a lot of that has to do with utilities saying we still will care about reliability first, affordability second, and responsibility or sustainability, interchangeable words, we'll care about that third. And so they want it to be reliable and affordable, and they just don't know. And so my sense is, power generation from fossil fuels, particularly natural gas, still has some chance to be around in 2040 if there is some solution around capturing carbon. Capturing carbon for sequestration purposes, but I suggest probably more likely capturing it for utilization purposes. And so pay attention to this group called Net Power out of Houston. They're using a turbine that they've kind of newly minted that it critically burns CO2 for power generation. There's still some emission that they're sequestering, but not much compared to what they're putting in. And so it's a critical combustion. And Occidental, a very big sort of oil and gas company in the United States, just purchased a 50% stake in Net Power because as an oil and gas company, they're really thinking about how do they play in the future. And so that's in the power generation side. I think there's a lot of folks in the oil and gas sector who are saying, okay, if we're really going to get to this reduction in hydrocarbons, not just because states are saying we have to, but because it looks like this is a real thing we're dealing with, greenhouse gases, that we have to be a part of the solutions. How are we going to be a part of it? On the mobility sector, I think a good example is Shell, Royal Dutch Shell, just brought their board to Colorado, or part of their board, to go to NREL, to the National Renewable Energy Laboratory, and to begin talking to NREL about its own transition. What role can a company that's at its core an oil and gas company play in a world where there's less oil and gas in the mobility sector? And I think that's on the mind of a lot of different companies, board companies. But I think that picture is less clear for all of those companies than it is in the power sector. On the industrial side, carbon capture and sequestration is going to probably have to be a part of that because our manufacturing sector relies so heavily on natural gas for manufacturing at the low price of natural gas. We really built a lot of plants in this country to begin manufacturing again. So carbon capture and sequestration on the power generation side and on the industrial sector side could help fossil fuels remain a part of our power sector, but I think that's less clear on the mobility side, and I think oil and gas companies understand that as well.
So critical need for innovation, plus perhaps some policy thinking. We only have Section 45Q for those of you who follow the federal policy environment. You can describe that to some folks, particularly to our guests from Europe and elsewhere. But what needs to happen on the policy front? Do you see the need for a push like there was for RPSs for CCU or CCUS?
There's some pretty interesting tools that say these policies will bend the curve downward on carbon this much. And it's hard to know how much innovation bends the curve, but I was on this National Academy of Sciences panel where it was our number one recommendation was to double down on research and development in the sort of carbon, how to constrain carbon, how to decarbonize. The number two thing was to put a price on pollution. Now, it doesn't get you to where you need to get to. It's not the final thing you need to do, is price pollution, which would include greenhouse gas emissions as a part of that. But we absolutely need to do that in this country. It would actually do the first thing. I think it drives innovation if you price pollution, price an externality that we're not pricing, that we're allowing to escape and actually pervert the energy economics. A group that understands this probably better than anybody. So those are two of the things that we need to do. State-by-state policy signals coming from them about emissions reduction that really do focus you sector-wide. And, if we don't price it at the federal level, state by state, looking at different ways to price it would be really important, and looking at ways to do it regionally so you're not having states compete with each other by not doing it and say our economy is going to be better than their economy at growing jobs. But I would say those are two significant federal policies to put in place. And then there's just a variety of other things you can do across the board that are about creating markets and financing markets. There's a big there are a lot of people that talk about the amount of money that's still sitting on the sidelines waiting to know how to invest in this transition, and figuring that out by having states form banks, green banks, all sorts of mechanisms for financing it is a part of it as well.
Yeah, well, I was just thinking back to the state and regional piece. We still have the RGGI, the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative in the Northeast. California still got a carbon price going forward. It'd be good to get a paper on board, see about the effectiveness of that with all of the other policies in those regions and or states. Andrew, you've been very patient. So Andrew Slaughter, also the conference chairman, but please introduce yourself and a question. If you
Sure. Andrew Slaughter with Deloitte. I just wanted to pick up on that point about carbon pricing. Economists have been saying for years that it's the single most effective tool in driving decarbonization, but you hardly mentioned it until the very end. And so to what extent do you think you can drive decarbonization without carbon pricing, as there seems to be no momentum behind carbon pricing ever in this economy?
So I would give you, there's a little bit of hope on carbon pricing. There are 10 Republican senators who've been meeting and talking about responding to climate. And part of that conversation is to look at some of the ideas out there, one of which is a carbon cap and dividend that's been promoted by a group of pretty prominent Republicans from years ago. Prominent, they were George Shultz, Jim Baker, Hank Paulson, folks like that came to Congress, came to the White House with this idea about cap and dividend. And I think, it depends on the presidential election of 2020, but there's a serious group, and there's a majority of people in the House that favor it as well. And so there is some hope. It would still take a long time to build, and so it's going to be a while. But then the question becomes, do we do it state by state? And so what New Mexico's looking at right now is it's a stakeholder group to ask what's the best way for a state to go about it. And New Mexico might well look at its own cap and trade. Oregon, the governor wants to go back to a cap and trade program. As Doug said, the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative is actually a carbon pricing mechanism. And so it's important that we do it at some point, I think, but it's not the only thing. There's a variety of other things that can get us a long way down the road that are an option in addition to pricing carbon. And again, research and development is a big part of it. Nuclear is an interesting issue currently. It's very expensive in the United States, and the cost of nuclear it makes it unattractive compared to natural gas, but you put a price on carbon, and natural gas generators have to pay some price on carbon. Nuclear may become more competitive, and then they may bring down the price of small modular reactors that are currently under application for permitting with the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. All those things could impact nuclear, and a carbon price is probably most significant among them for nuclear.
I'll just chime in here for a second. It reminds me of the National Academy's panel that we did America's Climate Choices now 10 plus years ago. And it's the same kind of question there in terms of a carbon price being economically ideal, but politically, frankly, a big challenge. And so there are lots of other policies there. And so we called it necessary but not sufficient. Because the politics of getting one passed, much like in California and still in the Northeast, is a small price. So it's almost, it's a good signal, but it's not economically sufficient to drive significant change. And so you need it as a signal going forward and the opportunity going forward relative to whether or not it's a cap.
It's interesting
forward.
I just saw this presented by an economist at Aspen. $50 a ton on carbon increases the price of gasoline at the pump by about 40 cents a gallon. And because the demand is so, would you say, inelastic for fuel in the United States, that doesn't change things much. That's why these fuel economy standards at the state level or the federal level will actually drive changes in our mobility sector more than a price on carbon, and why it's important to focus on other things beyond that because of the transportation sector.
Portfolio policies. Guy, please.
Thanks, Doug. Guy Caruso, CSIS. I was impressed with the amount of governors who ran. You mentioned 34, many of whom used either climate change or environment issues as a platform, and some of the legislators you mentioned. Was the issue of cost of reaching these aspirational goals, did it play much of a role in those congressional or governorship races? And you think the American public's ready for what it's going to cost? And you mentioned the price of decarbonization, and there's other costs of even efficiency, and all of which I think we all support, as we're all in favor of improving the environment, reducing emissions. But are we there yet? Will we see it come up, like say in 2020, national and senatorial races? What's your view as a long-time governor?
So on the cost side, let's talk about energy efficiency first. When we had the 13 states and convening all the states, we used economic modeling to demonstrate some of the different ways to get to emission reduction. And I don't know if you remember the Clean Power Plan. They had energy efficiency in there as a fourth pillar. And then they had all these comments that basically said, you don't have any authority to do that under the Clean Air Act. So they took it out as a pillar, but they left it in as an allowance for reducing emissions. And so we still modeled it, and it was absolutely the cheapest way to get to the targets in the Clean Power Plan was to do energy efficiency measures. And that's for places in the West where power is cheap. And, that Laramie River Station in Wheatland, Wyoming has one of the cheapest coal-fired generating plants in the world. And because it's so close to the Powder River Basin, and it's such a large generator, but you could still do energy efficiency in businesses in Wyoming and demonstrate a lower cost of complying than paying the alternative. On the cost side, it's interesting, our governor, he said 100% renewables, and I said, well, I wouldn't say that. I'd say 100% clean, because we don't know how to get to 100% renewables. We don't know how to get there in a way that's affordable. And there may be things over time. And he said, it just doesn't roll off your tongue like 100% renewable. And so he has campaigned on that. He's continued to say it. But he hasn't ever said, oh, by the way, if we tried to do that today, it's not going to be affordable. By setting a 2040 goal, and by saying, when we set a 30% goal, people said it wasn't affordable, and now it's cheaper than any coal-fired generation out there. You can kind of use that 10-year period to demonstrate that we don't know everything we need to know about what's going to be affordable in 2040, and that's why cost has not been a part of that. There's certainly naysayers that push back, but many of them are the same naysayers from 2007, 2008, 2009, and they've lost their credibility politically to be able to make that argument because they were so wrong in the beginning about that, or not the beginning, but back then, 10, 12 years ago. And so I think the fair thing to think about is it will be part of the conversation. If people are talking about 100%, or talking about 100% reduction in emissions, it'll be part of the conversation, but history's proved that we don't know enough to say exactly what the price is going to be.
Marianne?
I'm Marianne Koff from the Columbia Center on Global Energy Policy, and as a former gas producer, I have a concern that gas is just being pushed out of the equation, and there are methane issues and others, but putting those aside for a second, I look at the state of Texas and what's happened with the power sector. You have state renewable portfolio requirements, you have production tax credits, and we end up with negative electricity prices at night, and gas is really starting to be pushed out of Texas, even though we have all this trapped gas in the Permian. So here's my question for you. Given that we can't have a carbon price for whatever reason right now, does it make sense to have a performance standard as opposed to a technology standard? Should governments be choosing technology, or should we just set standards either for air quality or greenhouse gas emissions and then let the market figure out how best to get there?
Yeah, so I think some states are doing a combination of both. And, if you look at like the Southwest Power Pool's, I think 11 different states, it has days where 75% of its market is wind, of its portfolio, but there are also days where they go from this much wind to this much wind, and they fill that with gas. And so I don't think there's a way for us to produce power reliability in the United States without firming it with something, and that's likely to be natural gas for the foreseeable future, and a performance standard would address that.
Please, short questions now, and we're going to go short answers.
Very short.
We're on sides.
My name is Govinda Timisina from the World Bank. I have a very simple question. Despite such a low price of natural gas, why natural gas is not penetrating that much in the transport sector?
Why isn't natural gas penetrating that much in the transport sector, given its pricing?
First of all, the cost of transition is significant to go from another kind of conventional, oil, diesel, gas to natural gas. There's a significant cost, upfront cost on that, and so that capital outlay is significant, and now the transport sector is looking at skipping that capital outlay and instead transitioning to an electric vehicle motor because the cost of maintenance are so low, and the other kinds of things, the operation cost, the cost of maintenance are low. It's really just the battery that you have to figure out where electric vehicles are concerned. And I think, that's the equation that's in the mind of those medium and heavy-duty freight carriers.
Great. We're going to take actually both these two questions, and then we're going to run out of time. So please go ahead.
Great. My name is Jackie Dowling. I'm from Caltech, and I'm wondering, in the